My name is Pastor Andrew. I'm glad that you're here. We're going through study in Exodus this morning, and we're going to continue on with that series. And I'll begin by asking you a question. Have you ever witnessed something that made you think, I can hardly believe my eyes. I can't believe what I'm seeing. Something that almost seemed to not be real. And sometimes it's true. Maybe it isn't actually real. Shortly after it opened, my wife Karen and I went to see an illusionist at the Southeast Event Center. It was one of the first events that was there in person. It was fun to be in that place. And then he was doing all of these tricks. And I'm not a dummy. I know they're just illusions, and I know it's not real magic. But he was very good at what he did. And everything that he would do, I couldn't understand. I couldn't quite believe my eyes or believe what I was seeing. And while I know that that is an illusion, as we look to our story, we see that Moses had a much more literal experience where he could not believe what he was seeing as he encountered the burning bush. And so far in our short series, we've had our stories that were pretty short so far, just a few verses, and we're able to go almost verse by verse. Today is different. We are going to study the entirety of Exodus chapters 3 and 4. And so if you were to get the most out of this, it'd be great if you have a Bible with you, whether in your hand or in your phone. Whatever the case may be, you can turn to Exodus chapter 3, and as I share this story, you can follow along with it. This extraordinary event. What happened to Moses? Well, the story of the Exodus continues with Moses, and he's still in the land of Midian. He had grown up in Egypt, and then he had made the mistake of killing an Egyptian in his anger, and he had to flee for his life to Midian, which was a ways away. And he was at this time living in Midian and working with his father-in-law, Jethro. And as Exodus 3 begins, he is actively out in the wilderness or in the countryside, tending the flock of sheep for his father-in-law. And this would have been a fairly normal day for Moses because he had really settled into a new life in Midian. As far as he knew, all the doors were closed in Egypt. His new life was here in Midian. He had started a family. He married Zipporah and had 2 sons, Gershom and Eliezer. And at the time that he encountered this burning bush and his world changed, we know that Moses had been in Midian for 40 years, which is, again, another detail that Stephen gives us in his speech to the Sanhedrin in Acts 7:30. So Moses was 40 years old when he committed murder in Egypt and had to flee, and now he's been in Midian for 40 years. So he's 80 years old, fully rooted in his new life. And then all of a sudden, something happens, unexpected, something completely out of the ordinary. And this usual day takes a very unusual turn when he sees the miracle of the burning bush. Now, this was not just a bush on fire. It was a bush that was burning, yet it was not consumed. Meaning it wasn't eaten away at. It wasn't turning to ash. It was staying strong and healthy, and yet flames engulfed it. And if that weren't strange enough for you, not only was this a burning bush that was not consumed, but the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in a flame of fire out of the midst. So a bush on fire, not consumed, with the angel of the Lord appearing in the midst. Can you even imagine that? Could you close your eyes for a second and even try to depict in your imagination what a situation and a sight that must have been? That would certainly be something that would catch our attention. And this miracle did catch the attention of Moses. In Exodus 3:3, he says, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. He's like, oh, that I don't usually see when shepherding my flock. I better go check this out for myself. And as Moses comes closer, God calls to him out of this bush and tells him to come no nearer. Instead, he is to take off his sandals, for Moses is standing on holy ground. Why was the ground holy? Well, it had nothing to do with the physical location he was in. There was nothing special about Midian. He was in just kind of what seems to be a random place out in the countryside. It wasn't the location. It was all about the presence of God. The fact that God was there was what made it holy. And that's exactly how Moses felt. In verse 6, we see that God said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. This is an encounter with holiness, with the very presence of God. And everything, all the details in this passage, points to God's holy presence. It says that Moses was tending the sheep near Horeb. And Horeb is probably more known to you by its other name, which is Mount Sinai. This becomes the location where Moses meets with God in his presence as God gives him the law for the covenant with his chosen people of Israel later on in our story. This is going to become a place that will be synonymous with God's presence. There's also the presence of fire. And throughout all of Scripture, from cover to cover, fire is often an indication of God being somewhere, being present. Just in the rest of the Exodus story alone, we see that God's presence was made manifest as a pillar of fire at night to lead his people as they wandered through the wilderness. And then when Moses went and was about to meet with God, or the children of Israel were at Mount Sinai, the mountain was wrapped in smoke because God descended on it in fire, as we read in Exodus 19. So fire is an indication of God's presence. Then God also said that this was holy ground. And this declaration of a place, a physical place being holy, reminds me a lot of what would be the case with the Holy of Holies. In the tabernacle and the temple, when those things were built, there was the Holy of Holies, which was God's throne room on earth, where his presence was the most tangible. And no one could enter there. It was too holy. Only the high priest could go once a year on the Day of Atonement. Come no nearer. Right? This is all about God's presence. And then we also meet the angel of the Lord. Not an angel of the Lord, not a mere messenger, but the angel of the Lord. And when you read through the Old Testament in particular, we need to pick up that difference. An angel is an angel, but the angel is God's presence, again, made manifest. And as we continue to read on in Exodus 3, it's not an angel speaking to Moses, it's God speaking to Moses directly. So we know that this angel is the Lord himself. And this is called a theophany, when God and his presence are made manifest in a visible way for people to see. And when this theophany takes the form of a person, who are we talking about? God as person. Well, I would love to believe, and this is my own theory, that Moses was speaking to Jesus in the burning bush. God and flesh. Whatever the case may be, God shows up in person to call Moses for a particular purpose, and it all began when Moses paid attention. He was going about his normal, usual day, saw something that defied explanation, and made the decision to turn and go and see what was happening. And as we read through Exodus 3, I think it's a small but important detail that God only spoke to Moses after he decided to turn aside and to see what was happening at the burning bush. It says in Exodus 3, verse 4, when the Lord saw that Moses had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. God wanted Moses to see, to pay attention, to move his direction, and then he spoke to him. And if you want to hear the call of God in your own life, it also starts when you pay attention. Have your eyes open. What is God doing? What is he saying? What would he have me pursue? This is the very first step. What do you think God is calling you to do? You're never going to know if you're not actively seeking out an answer to that question. Is God prompting me to have a specific conversation with somebody? Is he maybe asking me to change some habits that are unhealthy in my life? Is he convicting me to set new priorities according to the teaching of his word? Perhaps it's a life change where God is prompting you to seek a higher education or leaning on you to change careers or communities. Whatever the question may be, or the answer to that question may be for you, you only find it when you begin to pay attention. Now, granted, I would like to think that if any of us were walking along and we saw a bush on fire, not consumed, with the very presence of God in the middle of it, we would probably all turn aside, right? Moses had it fairly easy. I think that was one of the most significant ways to grab anybody's attention. And we could easily say, well, if I saw a burning bush, I would do the same thing. But it is far too easy for us to dismiss the many ways in which we keep our eyes closed and become distracted. we need to be reminded of the importance of paying attention. And I would like to think that if Moses was on his phone while tending the sheep, he could have walked right past that burning bush, right? If he just never looked up. We have to pay attention. It's critical. And for us, it can be the busyness of our schedules. It can be social media. It can be going to work and spending too many extra hours there. It can be a hyper-focus on personal goals. All of these things can become obstacles to paying attention to God. And we're go, 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 go. And we don't look up. Author Ruth Haley Barton, from whom I've borrowed this idea for the first point, says this: we slide inexorably into a way of life that offers little or no opportunity for paying attention. And then we wonder why we are not hearing from God when we need God the most. So if you want to hear, if you want to understand God's call, start by opening your eyes. Put down your phones, find some silence and solitude, and listen to God. Now, once God had the attention of Moses, he let him know exactly what he was asking him to do. I would also love to have this clarity. God clearly appeared to him in the burning bush, and he also was very, very upfront with exactly what he wanted Moses to do. In verses 7 and 8, he says, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And in verse 10 he says, Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So Moses knew crystal clear what God was asking him to do. God had heard the cry of his people. He had remembered his promises to his people, and he knew that it was time to act. And so he will stay faithful to deliver them out of slavery and to bring them to a promised land flowing with milk and honey. And no, he's not talking about Kleefeld. He's talking about Canaan. And ever since God had made his initial promise and covenant with Abraham, that land was always part of the promise. And it probably seemed to the children of Israel that God had forgotten about it. But no, that was still in the mind and the heart and the design of God. And God had chosen Moses clearly to be this messenger and this means of deliverance. And this is why Moses was saved as a baby, brought out of that river. This is why he was raised in Pharaoh's household. This is why he was protected after his grave mistake of killing an Egyptian. God had protected him and led him and equipped him for this moment and for this work. So of course, with all of this clarity over his whole life, Moses immediately accepted the call of God. Right? So here I am, God, send me, let's go. I'll just go up to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. Well, that's not how the story goes. Instead of accepting this task given to him by God, Moses comes up with a few excuses. In fact, he makes 4 specific excuses. The first one was in verse 11. He says, Who am I? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? That was a valid question because at this point, Moses is really a nobody. He's still living with his in-laws at 80 years old. That's not really a way to launch your life, right? He had lost his status and power. He had lost the prestige of being in Pharaoh's household. He had been rejected by his fellow countrymen. Who made you prince and ruler over us? He was no one in and of himself. God's response was this: I will be with you. You see, it didn't matter who Moses was. It mattered who God was. And the Lord had plenty of status and power and authority to see this delivering work done. So Moses goes to his second excuse. Well, if the people ask me, what is God's name? What shall I say to them? Well, this isn't just about a name. It's not just about a title. What Moses is expressing here is that he doesn't really know who God is. This is about knowledge of God, and Moses feels like he doesn't have enough knowledge to play this role, to be a messenger for God that he doesn't really know in a specific way. How can God do this? Well, God's response is to give his name to Moses. And he says, I am who I am. and that is all in capital letters. He gives Moses his name, which we can translate as Yahweh. But as expected, this name is not just a title, something that you put on God's office door. This is more about his character, his essence, who he is. When we read, I am who I am, this can be understood as, I was, and I am, and I always will be. I am. In every moment, God is. He is holy. He is set apart. He is eternal. He's the one true God that remains the same. He is the only one, the only thing not dependent on anyone or anything else. God is. And he was, and he always will be. And if that sounds familiar, to paraphrase it that way or translate it that way, it's because we're reminded of Revelation 1:8, in which Jesus declares, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is, and who was, and who is to come, the Almighty. And in Genesis and Exodus and all the way to Revelation, who is God? He is. And he is the same God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he will always be the same throughout all the generations, meaning he will always be faithful to those promises, even the ones he made hundreds of years ago. That is who God is. That's the nature of the God that Moses is called to serve. He knows more about him now. And so he goes to his third excuse. Well, it's good enough for me, right? It's good enough for me. I saw the burning bush. I'm speaking to you face to face, so I can believe, but he says in Exodus 4:1, the people, they will not believe me. And I'm sure there's a bit of a personal connection here too. Moses had at one point tried to take some of this deliverance into his own hands, and he lashed out in righteous anger against the Egyptians. He was seen as he made this mistake of killing the Egyptian. And then his own people said, Who made you prince and judge over us, right? He's been rejected once. They've already said, we don't want you in this role. So now he's supposed to go back and make himself vulnerable again? Why would it go any differently? Why would the people believe me? Well, won't it just be written off as lunacy or pride? God responds again, and he gives Moses 3 miraculous signs to back up his claims. The first sign is Moses has a staff in his hand, likely a shepherd's staff, since he was shepherding sheep. And God said, throw it on the ground. And so Moses threw it on the ground, and it turned into a snake. Not my favorite sign. I would have asked for a different one if I was Moses. And Moses was afraid, and he backs away, and God says, pick it back up by the tail. And he grabs it and picks it up, and it becomes a staff in his hand again. Well, he says, if you need another sign, do this one. Put your hand into your robe. And he goes inside his robe, and he pulls it back out, and it's covered white with leprosy. God says, put it back in, and he returns his hand to his robe, and then pulls it back out, and it's healthy and clean. And then God gives him a third sign. And he says, if they still won't believe you, take some water from the Nile River, and God will turn it to blood. Which, for the astute student of the Bible will know that that's more than a little bit of foreshadowing of what is to come. So Moses has now been equipped with 3 miraculous signs to help prove the claims that he was really sent by God. And then he comes up with his 4th and final excuse. He says in verse 10 of chapter 4, I am not eloquent. And later on, I am slow of speech and tongue. Moses was not a good public speaker. And this was likely true. I don't think he was making up something just out of the blue or being dishonest with God. I think he probably was very aware that this was not a strong suit for him. He was legitimately worried about a weakness and a lack of skill in an important area. Because if you're going to go and talk to your people of Israel and convince them, that is going to be a lot of talking. Then if they're convinced, you have to go and talk to Pharaoh to let them go. That's going to be a lot of talking. He needs to be persuasive. And he's worried he can't do that. So God's response was this in verse 11. Who made man's mouth? Right? Who created you? Who gave you a mouth and a tongue to use in the first place? And then he says in verse 12, I will be your mouth and give you the words to say. God is reminding Moses, this isn't about you. I created you and everything and everyone else, and I'm more than capable of overcoming any weakness or lack of skill. I will give you the right words to say. And this time Moses persists, and he's not so easily placated by God's response. He says, I don't want to do this part of it. And God very angrily allows Moses to use his brother Aaron in almost a backup plan. He says, okay, Aaron can be involved. So God will now speak to Moses. Moses will speak to Aaron. And Aaron will speak to the others. Crystal clear, right? But that is now the plan. And once Moses has paid attention, once he's overcome his excuses, he's ready to go. And the same is true for us. Once we have paid attention, spent some time in silence and solitude, having our eyes open, our ears open to hear, right? Then we also need to work at overcoming our excuses for not following what God is asking us to do. We need to overcome excuses. And again, this is a very natural human thing to do. And I also believe that many of our hesitations will be similar to Moses. God might urge us or call us to do something, and we'll start by saying, well, who am I? Who am I? I'm no one special. I don't have power or influence. I don't have a lot of money or resources. I don't have a lot of clout in different areas. I'm just me. Why would God choose somebody like me? Or maybe you hesitate by thinking, well, who is God? If I'm going to be called by him, I should know him better. I'm not a pastor or a theologian. I haven't done extra schooling. I usually fall asleep during Pastor Andrew's sermons. Like I don't know enough about God in order to be used by him. Who is God? Well, who will listen to me and believe me? I mean, if I tell someone that God is calling me to do something, will they think that I am crazy? Will they just laugh and scoff and then look the other way? Will they belittle me? Will they even realize how important this is to me? I'm too embarrassed to talk about the nudging of God in my life. And who can do this better than me? I'm not gifted to be persuasive. I don't have the skills to do what God is asking me to do. Surely there must be someone out there more qualified than I am. We think all of these things. And oftentimes we think them so deeply and so strongly that it stops us and shackles us from carrying on in what God is asking us to do. And the answer to each and every one of these excuses and any more that we can provide is quite simple. It doesn't depend on you. It depends on God. That's how he responded to Moses each and every time. Who am I? God's like, well, no, who am I? Well, who are you? He says, I am. He says, well, who will believe me? I will give you a sign. Well, what about the words? I will give you the words. Each and every time. The answer to Moses, the answer to us is that it depends on God. He has the power and influence. He reveals what is true about himself. He can change people's perspectives. He can equip you with all the skills and abilities you need to succeed in the task that he has given you. So then these excuses are never really about us, as much as we might want to believe that. They're often more about our level of trust in God. Do you trust that he is calling you to do something? Do you trust that he will then equip you to do what he is asking you to do? Do you trust that he can be perfect in your weaknesses and in your shortcomings? And when we hear the call of God, we must deepen our trust in him and push past the many natural excuses that we have. And having heard this call and having his excuses addressed, Moses is convinced. And he begins the journey back to Egypt. He goes and gets permission from his father-in-law, says, can I move out? And Jethro says, yes, you can go and you can take my family with you. The Lord has also confided in Moses that it was safe because in Exodus 4:19 we read that all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So God says, now is the perfect time. You fled for your life. It was a valid reason, but you can go back to Egypt and you'll be safe. No one is wanting justice there any longer. And on the way back to Egypt, we read one of the craziest stories of the Bible. Exodus 4:24 and 26. And I had every intention of never preaching about this ever in my time here at Stony Brook. And then we had a youth that was reading the Bible on his own, and he asked me about this question, and he got me studying it, and he convinced me that, hey, we preach all of the Bible here, so let's read it together and see what we can glean from it. This is on his way back to Egypt. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him, being Moses, and sought to put him to death. Okay? Then Zipporah, his wife, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me. So he let him alone. It was then that she said, a bridegroom of blood because of the circumcision. And now you know why I did not want to preach on this passage. It's pretty clear, right? Why? Why is God wanting to kill Moses right after he called him to do something? Why in the world are foreskins showing up in this story? If you're a younger person in the congregation, you don't know what a foreskin is yet, just ask your parents after the service. They'd love to have that conversation with you. What are we to do with this story? Why? Well, when I was asked this and did some study on it, I think there is a very satisfactory answer, and it's really everything to do with obedience. This is a matter of obedience. Right? God had called Moses. He called him to specifically lead his people, to be his messenger. And in that role, he needed someone fully committed to him. But Moses was not fully following God because he was supposed to be adhering to the Abrahamic covenant, where all the male children were to be circumcised. And we know from the story, at least one of Moses' children was not, at least at the beginning of the story. And so there was a problem. There was a problem. And this would explain why the rushed circumcision by Zipporah of her child appeased God's wrath. Though I will admit, I have no idea what a bridegroom of blood means, and no one else does either. But it would make sense. In order for Moses to properly answer God's call, he needed to be fully committed in obedience. And there was at least one aspect of his life that Moses was holding back and not conforming to God's will or his law. And God says, this needs to be put in order before you can go and lead my people. And again, this will be the same for us. Where do we start? After we've paid attention, we have some clarity on something God's wanting us to do, we can overcome these excuses. What do we do next? Well, the next step is easy. You look to your own life first. You start with personal obedience. Before you go and encourage somebody else, or talk to somebody else, or represent God in a specific way, before you do those things, look in the mirror, spiritually speaking. And the Exodus passage is hard for us to understand that way sometimes, but the words of Jesus in Matthew 7 make it more clear. He says, why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Jesus teaches us as well that it all begins with our own spiritual assessment. By the way, it doesn't mean we can't help others. We surely can. We can go to our brother and sister, and we can love them and encourage them. We can challenge them and hold them accountable. We can point out areas of their life, but we must not do that before we've already taken stock of our own. We need to look in the mirror. And I'll be the first person in line that says sometimes when we look in the mirror, it's not always flattering. And there will be things that God is constantly asking us to continue to work on and improve and follow in more complete obedience to Him. And that's where we begin. We look to ourselves before we look to others. It's exactly like when we were puttering on the tarmac to get to the runway, leaving on a plane to go to Arizona, where it was nice and warm a few weeks ago. Obviously, when they do that safety thing, they always say, hey, if you need to help someone with their oxygen mask, what are you supposed to do? You put on your own mask first. And once you've looked to yourself, now you're in a position to help others. That's what God was, in a very extreme way, teaching Moses. That's what Jesus teaches us in Matthew. And it's part of what we must do to be honest and open in our calling in our life. So Moses does survive this encounter with the Lord. He goes back to Egypt. He meets up with Aaron and then meets up with all the Israelite elders. And he does everything that God has told him to say and do. They spoke all the words that God had given him out of the burning bush. He did all the signs that would prove that he had been sent by God and wasn't making things up. And the result was all the confirmation that Moses and Aaron needed to know that they were doing God's will. This is Exodus chapter 4, verse 31. And the people believed. And when they had heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel, and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and they worshiped him. They worshiped. And when we are faithful to hear and to act on God's call, it will lead other people to worship him. Because again, it's not about us. That was true with the excuses. It's not about our limitations or our faults or our failures. But that's also true with the credit. We don't do this for us. We don't do it for our own sake, for our own gain. We don't do it to fill up chairs in the church and to make sure that the dollars are enough at the end of the year. We don't do this for a notch in a belt and a feather in the cap. We do this for the sake of the holy Lord of Lords, the I Am, who was and is and who will always will be. We do this so that we and others around us may truly bow down and worship him. And if you are still wondering whether God is asking you to do something or not, if it's not clear to you, ask yourself this question: will it lead others to worship of him? And when that answer is yes, then we can all be confident that we are following God's call and that he is using our lives to expand his kingdom of mercy, grace, and forgiveness and love. And so we learn a lot from following the example of Moses and his actions and reactions at the burning bush. But we are left at the very place where it began. Come no closer. You are standing on holy ground, because I am God. And so we will conclude our service where we began, in worship of the one true holy God. Would you stand and then bow your heads with me? Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we are grateful that you are always who you are. Your character is never changing. Your promises to us are never failing. And there are so many situations and times and experiences in which we can feel this is called into question. But God, may we trust you. May we listen to you. May we rely on you. And may we worship you with our lives. Amen.